Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? All right, you win a prize because normally, I guess because we're in a library, when I say, how's everyone doing, they're kind of like, uh-huh. And then I always like, can you yell? But you got into it. That's fantastic. Thank you. My name is Aiden Flax-Clark. I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL, so I'm delighted to see all of you here and delighted for everyone who's joining us online as well. I get to introduce Ross Perlin and Suketu Mehta, who are here to talk about Ross's excellent new book, Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York. Hopefully you saw it's available for sale outside. I really encourage you to pick up a copy. Ross is the co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, and in his book, he writes about his work mapping little-known languages and sometimes disappearing languages all across New York, which is the most linguistically diverse city in history, which I did not know until I read the jacket copy, and it's a sanctuary of endangered languages. It's really excellent, so pick it up if you can. I believe Ross will be signing books afterward. And if you can't pick it up, that's fine, but you could use your library card. Everyone, of course, has a library card, yes? This exuberance is fantastic. Also, I'm glad no one said no, although you'd be a little interesting if you're like, no, you know, and I would come after you. So we're thrilled that Ross is joined by Suketu Mehta, who is, of course, the author of the genre-defining Maximum City, not to mention his more recent vital meditation on immigration in the United States, This Land is Our Land, which we got to hear him discuss when it came out back in 2019, and we're really happy that he's back here. And we are really proud to present this event as part of the library's 4th annual World Literature Festival. The festival, which takes place across the whole library system, shines a spotlight on books, writers, and artists from around the globe and reflects the many languages that are spoken across New York. So this is kind of a perfect event. And there are events happening in branches and here in this building over the next couple weeks, all kinds of amazing things going on. For our part, here in the Gregorian Center for Research in the Humanities, next week we have a talk with Nelia Kukovalska, who is the Director General of St. Sophia of Kyiv, which is a massive cultural complex in Kyiv. It's the largest museum complex in Ukraine, actually, and she's going to be talking about what it means to preserve cultural heritage there now, which is, of course, pretty important. Monday, April 30th, we're going to have the fantastic classics translator Emily Wilson talking about her recent translation of the Iliad, and she's going to be joined by some actors who are going to read from the book, and we've been going back and forth about what those readings are. I think they're going to be fantastic. And past that, there are all kinds of story times, interviews, panels, in all kinds of languages, Spanish, Korean, Russian, Mandarin, English, and more. Just as an example, this Saturday at the Riverside Library up near Lincoln Center, there's a very excellent panel called Theater and Dance as Language, in which path-breaking performing artists ask the question whether art can be a language. It looks like it's going to be really fun, and there's really so much more past that. So I really encourage you to go to nypl.org/World Literature Festival. It's as well as we can do for a short URL, apparently. And check out all the events. There are also links to all of our multilingual resources, as well as book recommendations for multiple languages for people of all ages. It's really, I think, one of the great things we do here at the library every year. Also, while you're at the website, go to nypl.org/live to find out about all of our events. We have coming up Russian historian Stephen Kotkin, novelist Colm Toybin, artist Kara Walker, novelist Neil Mukherjee, the great Michael Stipe, and a whole lot more. All of these events are free, so you don't have an excuse not to come. Tonight, if you want to ask some questions for Ross, hopefully you got a note card when you came in. Write down your question, and some of my colleagues will come by and pick them up. If you're watching online, you can put your questions in the chat or email us at publicprograms@nypl.org. We love to hear from you wherever you are, so please send up your questions. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without all of you. So thank you again for being here, and let's please give it up for Suketu Mehta and Ross Perlin.
Thank you all for coming. It's such a thrill and an honor to be here with Ross, who we have many really close friends in common, but we've never been on a stage together. So I've been reading this book with such delight because I'm a New Yorker and I teach classes on New York City. Some of my students are here today. And often when I read books about New York City that are really good, I feel really envious. And I think it was Gore Vidal who said every time he hears of a friend's success, something in him dies a little. But with this book, something in me comes alive because he's written it first so I can steal it for my book. This book is just, it's just full of fascinating stories and numbers. But it's also about love. And, I found myself really moved by so many of the stories in this book. So before I begin our conversation, there's a passage here that I read that really struck me with the quality of its writing. Now, if you've read books by linguistics experts, like people who teach linguistics, and you realize they're not very well written, that they appeal to other linguistic experts. And one reason that this book, I think, has received such rave reviews and should have a wide national and international audience is because it's written so well. It's written directly and honestly and lyrically. So I'll ask Ross to read a short passage from the chapter entitled A Brief Guide to Radical Linguistics.
Well, let me just say, first of all, thank you so much to all of you for coming. It's wonderful to be here with Suketu, a legend, one of the great writers on New York, on cities, on immigration, and to be at the NYPL, which is a completely unique institution, and as part of the World Literature Festival as well, which is extraordinary, as you've heard from Aidan. So thank you to Aidan, Margie, everyone from the NYPL, and to all of you for coming, and to Suketu. This is the beginning of a chapter called A Brief Guide to Radical Linguistics, as Suketu said. The baseless and pernicious myth of Babel in Genesis 11 suggests that linguistic diversity is nothing but confusion, divine punishment for the urban hubris that dared build a tower to reach the heavens. But in Genesis 10, the world was already diverse, with the descendants of Noah listed in a dazzling genealogy, 70 names long as the world's original nations, each with its own language, Ish Lilshono, or everyone after his tongue, as the King James Version has it. Even earlier in Genesis 6 through 9, Noah himself was commanded to safeguard the world's biodiversity in an ark. In many traditions, linguistic diversity is recognized as primordial and essential. In most of the world, multilingualism has been the historic norm. How we speak is the essence of where we come from, the grounding of self which enables us to connect with other, different selves. More than race or religion, language is a window onto the deepest levels of human diversity. The ubiquitous map of the world's 200-odd nation-states is recent and superficial compared to the little-known map of its 7,000 languages. Borrowing, code switching, mixing, hybridization, creolization, and language shift are all processes which attest to the fluidity of communication, but the core vocabulary of any given language can usually be traced back several millennia. At the heart of linguistics itself is a radical premise. All languages are cognitively and communicatively equal. Language is a universal and democratic fact cutting across all human societies. No human group is without it, and no language is superior to any other. Some languages may specialize in talking about melancholy or seaweed or atomic structure. Some grammars may glory in conjugating verbs while others bristle with syntactic invention. Languages represent thousands of natural experiments, ways of seeing, understanding, and living that should rightly form a major part of any meaningful account of what it is to be human.
That's almost a manifesto for linguistic diversity. So you pointed out that there's some 7,000 languages on Earth, and this might be the most linguistically diverse time in the Earth's history, and this might be the high point of this kind of diversity. Why is this so?
And we may be sitting, we likely are sitting in the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. And that's what the book is about. It's about the past, present, and future of the world's most linguistically diverse city, and what that means, what that looks like, what that feels like day to day. It's, as many as half of those 7,000 languages, 7,000 plus languages. We could talk about what's a language, what's a dialect, how do you enumerate languages. There are many challenges here, but linguists to some extent have converged on this number of 7,000 plus. As many as half are now considered endangered by linguists, which means not only that they have small numbers of speakers, in many cases a single speaker, or just a few speakers, and then you might ask, well, what does it mean for a language to be spoken or signed if it has just one speaker or a signer? But even more important than speaker numbers is intergenerational transmission, the passing of the language to the next generation, which usually happens in the home from parents, grandparents, caregivers. And languages have always come and gone. Certainly language is a completely fluid and dynamic fact of human existence. But the drop-off today is unprecedented. And the paradoxical fact, which is at the heart of the book, is that on the one hand, we have language endangerment and the loss of linguistic diversity paralleling in many ways the threats to biodiversity and resulting from a similar set of circumstances, compounding of centuries of colonialism, of nationalism, of just, urbanization has played this role as well. An extraordinary number of pressures which have resulted in and are resulting in language loss on a large scale, on an unprecedented scale. But at the same time, because of some of those forces, especially urbanization and migration, you see more of those languages, more languages concentrated, including many endangered, primarily oral, undocumented languages coming to cities like New York. And it's not only New York. We could also be talking about London or Paris or indeed Jakarta or Johannesburg or any number of other cities, and even smaller cities and towns as well. But there is a sort of a paradoxical moment that we're in where the languages are here. They're spoken by people all around us, our neighbors. Urban linguistic diversity, it's a fact of life now, but it may be transient. It may be just this moment because we barely recognized the presence of these languages among us, and we've done little to support them or even know that they're here.
How many languages are spoken in New York City? And give us some examples of some of the most arcane languages, or some with the fewest speakers.
At the Endangered Language Alliance, which I'm co-director of, and my co-director Daniel Kaufman is in the room as well, I describe, we may talk about the work of this organization in the book, but we've been around since 2010. For almost the last decade, we've been mapping the linguistic diversity of the city, which we believe is the first time that there's been a kind of linguistic census of a city in this sense, trying in particular to go beyond what the Census Bureau captures of language, which is very little. There's sort of one question on the census that only begins to scratch the surface, and we've found over 700 language varieties here. And if we were to kind of extend and talk about dialects and more particular varieties, the number would grow. And we've mapped them through both a print map and now a digital map at languagemap.nyc. Check it out afterwards. It's a kind of freely available tool that is an interactive guide to the city's languages as far as we know them. There are many languages that we surely have not been able to map or know about. And many of these languages are spoken by relatively small communities. Some are spoken by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, right? Besides English, which of course is a vital lingua franca for the city, or really I should say Englishes, because every variety of English virtually is represented here, just as every variety of Spanish. More varieties of Spanish represented in a single place than perhaps anywhere else in the world. But there are a number of languages, a dozen languages spoken really by over 100,000 people here, that each of which functions as a kind of lingua franca in a different part of the city. And I talk about then how there are whole microcosms of the world, basically. The linguistic diversity of entire regions shrunk down to the size of a single neighborhood And that's part of what characterizes the intricate linguistic geography of New York. So the languages of the former Soviet Union shrunk down to the size of Brighton Beach and represented there in a way that they no longer are perhaps anywhere, even in Russia itself. Or the languages of South Asia, kind of all encapsulated within a mile or two of Jackson Heights. The languages of over 100 languages of West Africa in Harlem and the Bronx. So it's these kind of unique linguistic microcosms. And then in the book, besides kind of detailing the story of how the city got this way, which we can talk about, I profile 6 speakers of a variety of endangered languages from different parts of the world, kind of getting into different situations and different stories of how people are trying to maintain and document and revitalize their languages. So I guess I can begin with at least a few of them. The one we open with is the story of a language called Seke, which I've been working on for several years with one of the youngest speakers, Rasmina Gurung, who moved from a particular valley called Mustang in Nepal to Brooklyn when she was a teenager. And this language is spoken by about 700 people in 5 villages in northern Nepal, up on the border with Tibet. And people are intensely multilingual. That's another theme of the book. More than half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. The speaking of, ability to speak 4, 5, or 6 languages is not at all uncommon on the streets of Queens. This is a normal thing, and this is a normal thing in the history of the world as well, multilingualism. As many as a quarter to a third of all Seke speakers have moved from this area in Nepal to really a few buildings in Brooklyn and Queens, forming what I call vertical villages that in some way are the sort of correlate or continuation of the villages in Nepal. And this is a predominantly oral language. It's quite different from both Tibetan, which it's related to, and totally different from Nepali, the national language. And we've been working to document it in both places, in both Nepal and New York. So that's kind of an initial example, but we can talk about the others as well.
That's fascinating. And New York is a kind of sanctuary or preserve for endangered languages around the planet.
Perhaps. This is the question, right? Will it be a preserve? Will it be, a place where they can continue to be spoken, or will it be a place of loss? Cities have long been associated with cultural and linguistic loss as well. The pressures to assimilate, the pressures to speak not necessarily even just English, but one of these other lingua francas as well, right? If you're a Seke speaker in Brooklyn, actually the pressure to speak Nepali, or to continue that shift to Nepali that may have already started in Nepal, may be just as intense initially as the pressure to speak English. Likewise, if you're a speaker of an indigenous Mexican language in Sunset Park or in Corona, it actually might be the pressure to shift or complete the shift to Spanish initially that's more important than the pressure to speak English. So cities present, and New York, of course, is sort of the most, the babble that has been going for longest and has reached the most extraordinary stage, perhaps, now 400 years into the colonial founding of the city on top of a Lenape-speaking archipelago. Whether the city can really hold its languages and be that kind of sanctuary, I think, is one of the animating questions of the Endangered Language Alliance. There are certain freedoms and opportunities that open up, perhaps in New York or in the US or in diaspora and in this capital of diasporas. But at the same time, the pressures to shift are immense.
So I grew up in Jackson Heights. I came here at the age of 14, and my parents worked in the diamond business. So I would go to 47th Street, and I spent a very unfortunate year working with my father on 47th Street. But there I became fascinated by the languages of the diamond district, which were primarily Gujarati and Yiddish. So it was Jews and Jains. And the thing they had in common was their orthodoxy, and their conversation was, "What can't you eat?" And then I realized that my father had picked up Yiddish. He knew all the Yiddish numbers. But he wouldn't reveal this to the Hasidic brokers that came to his diamond office, because he could figure out what they were saying among themselves. So he could, outwit them. But then later on, he realized that they also knew the Gujarati numbers. So this was learning language for commercial advantage through sabotage and never letting the speaker of the language know that you know this language.
The best way to learn.
But so in New York, among the people that you meet, like, is it a place where we come here and people who are monolingual before they come here become not exactly multilingual, but they're aware of all these different languages being spoken? So, for example, Mexicans who come here, some of them have to learn Spanish for the first time because they've grown up speaking one of 200 indigenous languages. Do you see that happen in the city?
People come multilingual, but then they gain other languages as well that they never would have gained anywhere else. And these sort of one-off combinations, these extraordinary kind of situations like the Gujarati Yiddish contact zone on 47th Street. And I understand there's also speakers of languages from Myanmar as well there. I've encountered speakers of Neo-Aramaic varieties who work in the Diamond District as well. And people have talked of a sort of almost a mixed language, right, that exists in the Diamond District because of this. And that's just one of many sort of contact zones that exist throughout the city and combinations that would perhaps not happen anywhere else. This idea of language contact, of languages that would perhaps never have been sort of in contact with each other, you know, on the other side of the world, or that were maybe part of the same family or have some kind of linguistic connection but used to be separated by hundreds of miles and are now suddenly a few blocks away. Is leading to almost what seem to function as kind of new languages, or certainly new kind of hybridizations that are happening. One I describe in the book, in the Himalayan community in particular, now that there are members of so many Himalayan diaspora groups here, is being called Ramaluk, which means basically neither goat nor sheep. And it's like neither fish nor fowl. It's not necessarily the best thing, but it's as like Spanglish or Runglish or other combinations, Runglish being the sort of Russian English that people talk about in Brighton Beach. Ramaluk combines elements of Nepali, elements of Tibetan, elements of English, elements of more local languages in a sort of one-off combination that, you know, is constantly being sort of created by its speakers and perhaps would not exist anywhere else. So, you know, these hybrids, the idea that in New York you go to a bodega, which is, we're talking about a Caribbean Spanish word, and that has to do with the Caribbean Spanish speaking owners, many of them Dominican, some Puerto Rican, Cuban, and now you will, inside the bodega, you will meet an ak. I talk about this in the book. This is a word from Arabic and reflects the fact that so many of them are now owned by especially speakers of Yemeni forms of Arabic. And that comes from aki, which is something like brother, but in New York has taken on the meaning of bodega owner. So there is such a like lexical kind of history underneath the city that reflects these lived realities and these really complex combinations and sort of one-off, you know, just extraordinary moments that, you know, can lead to sort of new cultures.
So your book's been received with rave reviews, and it's had some all the usual readers, you know, people who really love New York, and one really unusual reader who is also a native New Yorker and is actually from Queens. He got up recently and he said, New York, they have these languages that nobody's ever heard of. They don't even have one instructor that can teach that language. And this is a man who read something in the New York Times about your book and has started fulminating about it, and his name is Donald Trump.
I'm grateful to him for the press, yeah.
So your book might actually become an issue in the presidential campaign. Why is it that people have such resistance to people learning other languages? Like, what is it that pisses them off about people speaking in a tongue? I mean, Trump's mother spoke Scottish Gaelic.
He also referred to in some of these speeches that he's been giving to what he called truly foreign languages, which was also interesting. Truly foreign, what does that mean exactly? And then the sort of speaking about languages that don't have a single person that actually understands them in this country or can teach them, that's very true, and I think that's a reason for more funding for the Endangered Language Alliance and other institutions to support that. Linguists could use it. I think there is something. I think he's trying to, he's testing out a new line here, which is very interesting. The U.S. has no official language, right? The Constitution, of course, is written in English. Benjamin Franklin, I think, famously proposed possibly German, or there were some interesting ideas about what language should be spoken. But fundamentally, the U.S. has no official language. Obviously, English has been the lingua franca that has been used in de facto for so long, but it has a deeply multilingual history, right? Starting with the 300 plus languages spoken north of the Rio Grande at the time of European colonization, and then all the other languages which have come in since in different ways. New York, as I talk about in the book, having been a Lenape-speaking place, then is founded by the Dutch West India Company almost exactly 400 years ago. The first settlers are Walloon speakers. This is a threatened language of Europe on the Belgian-French border. And, it was never purely Dutch-speaking, never purely English-speaking. It was, unlike the other 12 colonies, which were generally English-speaking, this was a place where actually not even the majority of settlers were Dutch. Dutch came to function as a lingua franca, but you had a reported 18 different languages spoken by the first 400 inhabitants within the earliest decades. So multilingualism, as it has been globally, but in New York especially, but in this country, on this continent, has been a fundamental part of our history. And so in this sense, what Trump and proponents of so-called English-only movement, which has been gaining ground in sort of Trumpian circles in the last few decades, represents a radical departure, actually, that they're hoping to impose. And I think it's something viscerally that monolinguals, if they're already sort of fearful, there's something viscerally about hearing another language that can actually really exacerbate that fear. And, and it seems that he's trying to sort of tap into something very viscerally where just the sound of another language can enrage somebody who is perhaps already feeling threatened.
All this opposition to bilingual education, I've had first-hand experience with this when my older son, Gautama, when he was 2, we put him into a YMCA, a preschool. And I went to pick him up, and I saw that he was playing by himself because he was raised speaking Gujarati, and he couldn't communicate with the other kids. So then I pulled him out of this preschool, and I took him to a place called the 3rd Street Music Settlement, which is actually on 11th Street. Where the language of instruction is music. And I remember when I went there the first time, the principal, I told the principal he's going to need some transition into English. And he said, okay, well, bring Gautama, when you bring him here the first time, bring a song in his language. And there was a lullaby, not in Gujarati, but in Hindi, that he'd grown up with. And I brought this taped lullaby, and there was a teacher with a piano, and she listened to this lullaby, and then she turned to a whole classroom full of little kids from all over the world who were speaking in English, and then she started playing this lullaby on the piano in Hindi, la 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 lori, and then she said, children, this is Gautama, and this is his language. Let's all learn this lullaby. And so Gautama saw this whole classroom of kids singing in his language. By the end of the week, he was speaking English. And he's now here in this room, and he's a journalist. So that teacher taught me something really valuable about education, which is that if, she made his language feel welcomed in that classroom. And it strikes me that this is how we get new immigrants comfortable in the city. We recognize and respect the languages that they come in with first before we ask them to learn English.
I think there's fundamentally no contradiction between the maintenance of the languages that people are coming with, which, however you want to see it, we can call them assets, we can call them deeply valuable sets of knowledge that people have, cultural traditions. There's no contradiction between the maintenance and development of those and participation in a wider lingua franca, be it English, be it Spanish, be it something else. And in fact, as you say, it's not just that there's no contradiction, there's actually a kind of crucial interlocking relationship between the two. And language affirmation, as some are calling it, is really in some ways just as important as sort of translation and interpretation, which of course are also sort of fundamental things. And there's a reason why, you know, every kind of customer service thing begins with a sort of phone tree where it's like press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish, right? We need to talk about language. We need to sort of acknowledge language even before anything else can happen. It's the sort of basis for any further communication or conversation. And so even to learn, 1 or 2 words of somebody else's language, or just to make space for and acknowledge the presence of a language. We've seen this a number of times with our language map as well. Just even somebody seeing the name of their language on a map and seeing it printed for the first time. I mean, we've stood on the streets of the Bronx and saw somebody actually just sort of looking at where they were in the Bronx and seeing the name of their parents' language, which they had, you know, they had forgotten. Was, you know, it's an extraordinary experience for people just to feel that there is sort of room and space. And it's out of that, I think, I mean, people will, you know, they will learn the languages they need to learn for practical life. Language is something that kind of grows out of time spent with people. I call it in the book an index of time spent with people. It's part of experience and life. And in a city of so much and in a country of so much kind of mixing and change and, you know, it's inevitable. But I think we need to look at what is being lost as much as what is gained.
I remember Daniel, your collaborator in the Endangered Language Alliance, telling me about hearing one of the people you'd brought in to record his language, who started crying because he didn't think he would hear this language in New York, and that the very fact that it was respected, that it was being recorded. So tell us a bit about the work of the Endangered Language Alliance and how you preserve these languages.
So the Endangered Language Alliance was founded in 2010 out of a recognition that we're in the most linguistically diverse city in the world. What can we do about this as linguists, as language activists, as ordinary New Yorkers, as artists? It really, it's about sort of changing our idea of where endangered minority and indigenous languages are, that they're not always on, you know, a distant mountain or island, but that they're right here among us. And creating a space, creating opportunities for people to use their languages in the middle of Manhattan. First of all, certainly to document them, right? Many of these languages we're talking about, they're, you know, only something like 5% of the world's languages are on the internet at all. We think of the internet as having all of the knowledge. Even the most fantastic libraries like that in which we sit really can only have collections of books because there only are books in a small percentage of the world's languages. So this is really, these languages are the repositories of human experience and human knowledge, but they're mostly being carried around in the heads of a small number of people. And so to bring out that knowledge, to document it, to be able to do that in sort of long-term partnerships and relationships in the middle of a city where we're all sort of living together. And then also to provide experiences for languages to be used on stage and in settings that they never would be otherwise. If linguistic diversity is going to have a future, it has to be in cities. This is where people have come to. This is where people are. You know, that's what we try to do.
What's the most linguistically diverse neighborhood in New York City?
Well, since you're here, I have to say Jackson Heights.
Thank you.
And it happens to be perhaps true. I mean, every language every neighborhood is diverse in a very different way. I talk in the book about my neighborhood in Queens, but you know, it's certainly, there is a sort of patterning to it, right? Historically, Manhattan was every bit as diverse as anywhere, but now really we're talking about the outer boroughs. We're talking about Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens. And certain hubs for various reasons. I mean, Jackson Heights is a transit hub. It also now has sort of layers upon layers of different communities that have sort of followed each other. It's also, you know, it has different zones kind of backing up onto one another. You know, Jackson Heights is extraordinary, but so is Harlem, so is Brighton Beach, so are several dozen neighborhoods that people who don't live in them rarely go to.
And New York is the most linguistically diverse city in the world, you would say?
Such is my belief. I may be biased, but we've been documenting it for the last decade or so. The book, the map, the work of the ELA. I would love to see similar work for London, for Paris, for any number of other cities. I think they each, in their own way, are sort of different extraordinary babbles. We've been hearing increasingly from linguists in different places who are using the language map as we released the code as a open source code for people to build their own. It's happening in Berlin and Nairobi and Los Angeles. There are attempts to do similar work, and I think you would find differently extraordinary patterns.
And speaking of coding, so the AI uses these large language models to trawl through the internet, and so what's the future of computer language, of the language of AI? Like, if there are these robots who will be ruling our lives, like what language will they speak? Is it going to be English? Because so much of the internet is by default in English.
I think we'll probably all be turned into paper clips before we have Seke speaking chatbots, but we'll see. One of the stories in the book is about Ibrahima, who is an activist for UNCO, a relatively new writing system from West Africa, one of 20 different writing systems which have sprung up in West Africa in the last 2 centuries. And this one is meant to unite a group of languages there called the Manding languages. And he and other activists for this writing system have been working to get it into Unicode, which is a necessary step for any kind of digital encoding so that we can read it on phones and computers. And now also, everything, spell check, software support, texting. And it's a constant battle for language activists, many of whom want to see their languages represented technologically and in those spaces, to the extent that, VR and AR and AI are sort of new domains. The presence of a language there, just as the presence of a language in New York, is a very significant and crucial thing. And we use a lot of technology in our work as well. It's certainly part of documenting and archiving languages and mapping them. So, it depends on what's commercially viable for the big tech companies. I think to some extent we see they're contacting us, they're wanting to sort of take our data and see if they can train models on it. It's also scary to think about really relying on that at all, and what some of what we've seen them do is just really atrocious in terms of how bad it is. I mean, hilariously bad, the way it sort of tries to guess from a few hours of material what the sound system of a language is or how something functions grammatically. So we're not there quite yet in terms of those things really being used, and would certainly be dangerous to rely on them. It's there are going to be all sorts of strange linguistic developments coming, I think.
I think we have some time for questions. There's some index cards, so we can get in the Q&A portion. I'll ask you one more question before I get the question. So there's a Yiddish linguist, Max Weinrich. I don't know if the attribution is correct, but apparently he once explained the difference between a dialect and a language. And he said, a language is a dialect with an army and navy. And my mentor, the great Kannada writer, U.R. Ananthamurthy, he was telling me about this, and he said, and an international language is a language with an atom bomb behind it. So what's the relation? So what is the difference between a language and a dialect, and and what's the relationship between language and power?
There's a fundamental connection, certainly. From a linguistic point of view, we try to talk about mutual intelligibility, the idea that two people speaking to each other in their native way at a normal pace, if they can understand each other, basically, we can say that they're perhaps speaking 2 different dialects of the same language. If they can't understand each other, we can say that they're speaking 2 languages. Of course, there are a lot of questions behind that, what mutual intelligibility is actually about, how well they know each other, what they're talking about, a lot of other things that go into it. But fundamentally, I mean, these words, language and dialect, we should remember that these are English words that have their own particular stories, as with every word. Language is a Latin word, ultimately connected with lingua, the tongue. Dialect is actually a Greek word, not unrelated to the ideas of dialogue. And sometime in the Renaissance, they got sort of tangled up with one another and were left with both of these words. But, and they've come into a number of Western European languages, but those words themselves are quite different. The way people talk about forms of speech and levels of language is quite different, actually, in different languages. So that also it needs to be sort of looked at. People have different ideas about what they're speaking. And language essentially is so kind of fluid that even to call it a thing, or even to sort of try to put a name on it and say that this is one thing, that we're all speaking English here, is an abstraction, certainly. Perhaps a useful abstraction, and there are reasons to do it. But so I think that, in the popular parlance, power is a big part of why we call certain things languages and certain things dialects, whereas from a linguistic point of view, the variousness is omnipresent. And an army and a navy help a lot. Before you have a language academy, you need to have an army and a navy. We don't have a language academy in this country, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Académie Française and similar other institutions that that define what the standard way of speaking is. We have other ways of doing that through textbooks and school and media and so on. But we're all subject to these forces, little though we may kind of remember it or recognize it, that are standardizing our speech. Of course, some of them are subtle and interpersonal, but others are coming really down from on high and are influencing the way we sound, the way we express ourselves, no matter how personal we feel we're sounding or being. These things are coming from processes of standardization that often begin with power.
Okay, there's some great questions here, so I'm going to have a tough time choosing, but we'll take as many as we have time for. So, there's a question. Somewhere I heard, when you lose a language, you lose an entire thought world, or even the way of thinking. Can you speak more to this?
Sometimes people see translation as a process of just kind of changing the labels that are hanging on all the objects of the world, right? That we can just sort of swap out that this is a cup and there's 7,000 words for cup. With cup, that might be the case, but with many things, the way we divide up the world, the way we actually, even the body, even the idea of arm and hand. I mean, I would challenge all of you to say, where does an arm and a hand begin? We might say here or there, but it's actually different for speakers of different languages. The way you divide up the body, the way we divide up the world. And then when it comes to the thought world, it becomes even more complex, right? What kinds of things we have words for. And with grammar as well, and grammar is something that is almost kind of unconsciously kind of lies beneath all of our linguistic choices and moves. And that even more so, there are certain languages that make you mark certain things and make you do certain things unconsciously once you've learned them, versus others which won't mark those things at all, right? So in that sense, there's a whole kind of historic controversy in linguistics, sometimes known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is, this question of to what extent our native language presumably dictates kind of how we think. Multilingualism itself poses a challenge to that, right? I mean, we could say, oh, well, I speak 5 languages, I have 5 selves. Sometimes people feel that way, but it's, in practice, I think, much more complex and kind of overlapping and interlocking. And, nonetheless, I would say that there is something to this idea that every language does have its sort of characteristic ways in certain, of talking about certain things, of doing certain things, certainly its characteristic sounds, its characteristic grammatical features.
Can you think of some words which you've heard in languages which don't exist in other languages? A word that really captures something which you found really remarkable.
The search for untranslatables is a famous kind of search, and we're asked all the time, like, oh, is there a word that we just can't translate that's resistant to translation? And I think there are many, I think, that are certainly, take entire sort of books to translate, essentially, that might be kind of glimpsed in a moment. What's funny, I think, is that some people, when they're looking for these, kind of come out and say, oh, Portuguese speakers will always say saudade, this is our special word, but there's, which has to do with a certain kind of longing or whatever, but then there's also very similar words in a number of other languages. So yeah. I think there are more of these connections than we think, but you know, I think an example even, right, that's in the book for seke is this word dilhawa, which is basically, you know, a particular ritual that has to be described in some detail to understand it at all. And it can be sort of literally translated as something like throwing the spirit or throwing the demon. But to actually understand what that means and what goes into it is to enter a whole other conversation.
Are online services like Duolingo or Babbel a good thing? Should there be a more accessible but challenging way to learn a new language?
At this point, we're not sort of sponsored or I have to choose my words carefully. It's fascinating how popular some of these things are, right? Duolingo is almost a craze. I don't know how many millions are on there learning. You now have, people will say, more people learning, you know, Irish on Duolingo than there are Irish speakers in, you know, in the Gaeltacht areas of Western Ireland and so on. I mean, you hear these enormous numbers of people. Now we all know that to some extent it's people kind of jump on for a few minutes and then they kind of lose interest, or they get busy, or they do it on the subway a little bit. There's something extraordinary there that's driving people, right? There's a deep desire to learn other languages, to reach into these other worlds, to extend our own kind of, you know, cognitive and emotional selves into these other universes. And, you know, I think that they're good as first steps, moments of entry, but they're not replacements for that index of time spent with people, for that fundamental step of actually being with other speakers and being part of that world, and playing those language games, as it were, as Wittgenstein talks about language games. You know, that the actual sort of moments and times and ways of being that go into what it means to speak a language. So we just have to not kind of forget about the real thing.
We're not going to have a chip implanted in our brains which will allow us to translate all other languages.
The babblefish. Yeah.
There's been so much talk about recent waves of migrants being bused to New York City. What languages are coming with them?
This is still something very much in progress, and you know, I talk about it a little bit at the end of the book, but I think it shows how the unfolding history of the city is still completely bound up with migration and mobility. This is fundamental to our history. There's a particular challenge now, of course, in the last couple of years that has to do with the political antics of the busing, as well as the intersection with the housing crisis and other political crises. But you know, I think we're seeing a new Venezuelan city coming into being. So with Venezuelan Spanish, you know, becoming a part of the city's fabric in a way that it never was before. We're seeing indigenous languages of Ecuador, varieties of Quechua in particular, that were here already since the 1990s at least, but are growing. We're seeing the presence of African languages, especially Wolof and varieties of Fulani, and Hassaniya from Mauritania, among others, and it's just, you know, and more, and many others that we're even hearing about through our work with city agencies. Just, you know, individuals as well who are speakers of, you know, might just be one person who speaks a language. So it's this history is being written.
What happens to a language when it loses its historical homeland and only exists in diaspora communities in New York City?
There are these cases. I talk about them in the book. One section is devoted to the story of Yiddish, which has lost essentially its original European, Eastern European homeland, and now the world center of it really is Hasidic Brooklyn, where it's going into the fourth, if not the fifth generation, which is a sort of extraordinary story of language revitalization and growth. It went from being demographically one of the oldest languages in terms of its speakers to now where half of all New York Yiddish speakers are said to be under the age of 18. And that comes perhaps at a price too. I mean, there are questions about you know, how that is achieved, what that means. I think debates that are happening even within the Hasidic community as well as between the Hasidic and non-Hasidic worlds. But likewise, there are sort of other cases as well. The example of Garifuna, which is an Afro-Indigenous language with roots on the island of St. Vincent, where enslaved Africans escaped, intermarried with Arawakan speakers, and created a new language essentially, which then was exiled to Honduras and Belize, and then sort of now in triple diaspora is probably more is perhaps more widely known in Brooklyn and the Bronx than anywhere else. So there is a special kind of challenge to these diaspora situations that, in some cases it makes a community sort of realize that actually the homeland is here, and that the language has to be, it has to be kind of valued and worked on and developed here, which is an extraordinary pressure, because to not have that homeland, to not have that connection anymore is, is to be sort of cut adrift in certain ways. But I think it's one of the extraordinary opportunities that perhaps a diaspora capital can afford, which is a sort of language as a portable homeland.
Are there languages which have evolved recently only in New York? Like, what's the current equivalent to toity-toid and toid?
Of course, we have to talk about New York City English, yeah. Toity-toid and toid. So New York City English, paradoxically, very much itself a product of immigration in a lot of ways, has itself kind of retreated to some extent from the city. It's carried, for the most part, I would say, actually by second and third and fourth generation immigrants in some cases. But it's this, New York City English anyway is this kind of unique case of a relatively uncommon case of the speech way of a very powerful city actually being very low prestige. But in terms of new languages, I guess, yeah, the closest thing is to point to these words like "ak." Somebody has described to me how what happened has become a kind of a new phrase. I don't know if you've heard this, but the kids these days are saying if they don't hear you, instead of just saying kind of what or what is that or like what, you say what happened. Is kind of a new phrase. But there are sort of these lexical and kind of grammatical innovations and changes in intonation that are happening. These mixed languages like Ramaluk that I talked about. The question of what Spanglish is, it looks very different in New York than in California, for instance. And again, to say that these are sort of things that we can sort of put into a box is perhaps premature, because they're evolving.
What have been the most successful attempts at preservation of endangered languages in New York City? So with the ELA or other organizations, have there been success stories you can point to, things which have worked?
So that I should make a distinction between language documentation, which is now in recent decades has become a sort of subfield of linguistics and is about creating dictionaries, creating recordings, at least sort of documenting the languages that are, which is one thing, and that's, I think, where linguists can most clearly play a role, versus the continued maintenance, or sometimes when people talk about preservation, they actually mean that the language continues to be spoken, passed on, or it's revived. And that, of course, is ultimately always up to a community. It's always up to the speakers. That involves a legion of challenges. But we are, in some ways, in a golden age of language revitalization worldwide, which is, again, kind of growing up in response to language loss. And really, Native American linguists and speakers and language activists are kind of leading the way. So among the most extraordinary cases are Wampanoag, which was, this is not in New York City, but just as a prelude. This is the language that the Puritans first encountered in Massachusetts, and then there was kind of one of the very first books that was published in North America was a translation of the Bible into Wampanoag. The language sort of ceased to be spoken almost 2 centuries ago, but has been revived by Jesse Little Daubert, a member of the tribe who studied linguistics, and a number of other Wampanoag activists have revived it to now be a spoken language again. And these are building on efforts that are happening. Of course, the story of Hebrew is well known, but Hawaiian and Maori and Catalan and Welsh, and there's a number of fascinating cases of language revitalization which are increasing in recent decades. In New York, to some extent, this is sort of untested waters, right? The documentation side is something that we've been able to do a certain amount. Certainly, the case of Yiddish that I just mentioned is a fascinating case of revitalization in the city, and we see it on even just the level of individuals, even to be able to bring one new kind of native speaker of a language is something extraordinary. So, I think it again kind of remains to be seen to what extent these strategies for language revitalization can work in cities. It's just now being attempted, I would say.
What would you like to see in terms of government support, federal, state, local, for this kind of language preservation and documentation? Like, what can schools do? What sort of attitude to linguistic diversity would you like to see?
I think the first thing is for governments to stop, pressuring as much, in some cases making it even illegal in many parts of the world to speak certain languages, right? So that there's a long history. Not only has all the government support in pretty much every country gone really just towards the national languages or the major languages, but in many cases, other languages have been actively suppressed. So, the initial stage is just to sort of take that pressure off and, allow that a Tibetan-speaking activist or a Kurdish-speaking activist to do something in their language. It's been sort of seen as a political act, even just to use certain languages. That said, it would be interesting to start to see actual support on the part of governments for multilingualism, the recognizing that these languages are kind of extraordinary and valuable things that contain knowledge and poetry and history and potential and that are being brought to their shores. New York has become something of an interesting model in this regard. So just in the last really decade or two, there is now support of some kind for the 10 largest languages, which are known as citywide languages at the city level. You may have noticed if you're on the subway, on the 2-3 train, you'll see something in Haitian Creole. If you're on the BQ, you might see something in Russian. Every city agency is supposed to kind of take this into account in some way. In practice, it's a tiny drop in the bucket. It's really just like, one or two people in an agency having a sort of a plan and trying to make sure that major languages are served. Likewise, we get so many requests for translation for the courts, hospitals, schools. These are the places where it sort of matters most. Most of this burden is still totally borne by communities and by the speakers themselves. But it would be interesting to see the building of what I call a linguistic infrastructure for Babel, and to imagine how we might actually sort of understand that all this multilingualism is at the heart of what makes this the place that it is. It's one thing to go sort of enjoy a night out in Jackson Heights and say, oh, let's go to that new Nepali place, let's have some momos, let's do this, let's do that. But to understand that that's not just, something that is just there magically. It's undergirded by all of the linguistic, cultural background that people are bringing to the city.
Who determines the 10 major languages of New York City? Is there an office of major languages?
It's supposed to be determined on the basis of census data, which is tricky because of what I mentioned with census data, and it's supposed to be reevaluated every so often. In practice, as always, it's an area of kind of contestation, and this is part of what makes the city, right? Different groups saying, well, we need our language to be represented in some way. So it's a very particular, classically New York group of languages. You don't just look at the world map and say, oh, these are the 10 biggest languages. In New York, it's Bengali, it's Haitian Creole, it's Yiddish, and this is now happening at the state level as well. So Yiddish actually is only at the state level, not at the city level, but Bengali, Haitian Creole, Russian. It reflects the particular kind of dynamics of migration and who is here. We have bilingual education programs now in 13 different languages. Now, in some cases, that's just one Japanese language school in East Williamsburg, which I think is the only one of its kind in the country itself, a kind of extraordinary experiment. We're talking about public schools. And of course, there's still always, these are dual language. There's plenty of English. People are learning English as well. But it's kind of an extraordinary moment where we can at least begin to see, and I think the World Literature Festival also represents this, that there are events in Chinese with Chinese-speaking intellectuals, in Russian with Russian-speaking artists, in Spanish with Spanish-speaking authors. This is part of what it means to live in a global city. This is what makes it the place that it is.
do people get mad when their languages fall off the map of the 10 top? Like the Michelin stars. Last year I had 3 stars, and I'm number 11 now.
I think it happens. It's part of the linguistic dynamics of the city. Certainly, I think there's been interesting discussions about, like, Italian, for instance, once one of the most widely spoken languages of the city, but it was actually never even Italian, really. Italian might have had sort of that, been seen as that, but it was actually, people were speaking varieties of Sicilian, of Neapolitan, Southern Italian varieties. That's what people were actually speaking. But one comes, another goes. This is, it has to be, we haven't yet seen, there hasn't been enough time to kind of see all of these ups and downs across time in the official languages. But certainly in terms of the linguistic history of the city that I try to trace here, it's dynamic, it's changing. It reflects different parts of the world that people are coming from. As long as it continues to evolve and change, I think that's what we need.
Well, I know what we here in this room can do to support linguistic diversity, which is buy Ross's book. Ross will be signing his books here, and I hope you stay for that. And thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you, Suketu. Thank you for coming.